it may be a bit hard to believe, but Resident Evil as a horror video game series has, since the very beginning, appealed to two very different types of people. On the one hand, were the folks who played Resident Evil as it was likely always intended to be played, as a survival horror game, one that focused on item and resource management as the core driver of fear in said horror experience. But equally notable, perhaps even more so as time went on, was the group that played Resident Evil as an action game. Players who ultimately were more focused on facing off against the zombies, mutants, and bioterror creatures that Resident Evil as a video game threw at them. The horror came from the setting, the vibe, and the story. And while you may be tempted to think that Resident Evil jumped on the so-called action bandwagon with Resident Evil 4, there was actually always a subset of the game's audience that played even the earliest PS1 games in a way that would probably surprise a lot of the survival horror purists. If you say, flipped on Resident Evil 1, 2, or 3 on the PS1 and started it on easy mode, for instance, then you actually got a dearth of ammo, resources, and healing alongside the more forgiving difficulty in terms of damage and whatnot. The game then became more about blasting your way through the game's many monsters, solving the puzzles, and generally soaking in the vibe and the atmosphere. The survival horror and the management aspects were, for the most part, completely circumvented. And for those people, of which I counted myself very much among, given that I started Resident Evil much earlier than I likely should have. I mean, I started the series with Resident Evil 3 when I was a wee little 12-year-old. To those people, Resident Evil has always been this horror game that has also doubled as a sort of power fantasy. A horror experience that you face and overcome rather than barely survive through. Now, for the people actually making Resident Evil, this has always led to a sort of problem. What group do you as a developer cater to? The hardcore survival horror purists? The people who do crazy things like knife-only runs? Or the more casual but likely larger action game audience? And the answer to that question, well, it's always been to tilt the games in one direction or the other. Resident Evils 4, 5, and 6 went heavy on the fun action side of the equation, while the remakes and the newer games in the series have focused on delivering a more tense, resource management style horror experience that is more in line with the classic games from the PlayStation 1 era. And so, the solution to the problem has always been this: one or the other, action or horror. That is, until now. Capcom and the folks behind Resident Evil have, with the 9th entry in the series, Resident Evil Requiem, finally done the seemingly impossible. They mixed both survival horror and action together and balanced them perfectly. And the result? Resident Evil Requiem is perhaps Capcom's most successful Resident Evil game ever. It sold about 5 million copies in its first week on sale, and everyone from fans to newcomers are vibing with this game. They're loving it and going crazy over it online. It really is a game that's both succeeding with its core audience and expanding outwards into the larger, general video game zeitgeist. And while there's certainly a lot you can point to with regards to this game's success, the excellent atmosphere, the superb graphical fidelity, the imaginative art direction, the sound design, the characters, the story, the gameplay, and the game design, the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that continues to blow me away, is in how the game uses both action and survival horror to great effect. It's that interplay between the two. It's in how they both balance each other and in how they also enhance one another. That combination is, I think, not only the winning formula for this 9th Resident Evil game, but it's also what I believe to be the formula for the series to refine and expand upon moving forward. For it's in how the game does this particular thing so effectively, in how it paces its horror and its action segments so well, that the game ends up becoming a game for almost every Resident Evil fan, if not general horror game fan. No, really, this is a game that's been lovingly crafted for fans of the genre, and for this series in particular. It's a game that features a new, unique, and wholly original protagonist alongside a fan favorite old one. It's a game that pays homage to the roots of the series and does a ton of lookbacks and fan service, while also pushing the franchise forward in really interesting ways. And it almost becomes a sort of soft reboot of sorts. Resident Evil Requiem feels like the complete package, the Resident Evil that fans have been waiting on and that they never knew they could actually have. So, let's examine all of that. Let's look at what makes Resident Evil Requiem not only the best new Resident Evil to come out in some time, but really what makes it the game that truly brings about the potential of the entire franchise. A bit of a warning before we begin and proceed. This video is going to contain spoilers for Resident Evil Requiem moving forward. In order to truly appreciate what this game does well, I have to give examples. Gameplay ones, story ones, and of course, that means that if you haven't played the game yet, then well, I'd recommend doing so before you watch the rest of this video. There's a lot to Requiem that is best experienced blind. So, play the game, and then let's all appreciate what it does so darn well. And if you don't want to do that and want to continue forward, then well, as always, viewer discretion is advised here. Now, you may be tempted to think that because I just touted Requiem as the best Resident Evil to come out in a long while, that the game itself is nearly flawless. But that actually couldn't be farther from the truth. Resident Evil Requiem is most certainly an uneven, flawed game, and it has some serious issues, particularly in its second half. It's far from perfect, but as anyone who's played and finished the game will tell you, the game's flaws don't really take away from what it does so darn well, not in the slightest. See, the first half of the game really is the template, the blueprint, for what Resident Evil as a series needs to be and has likely always needed to be. I mentioned before that Requiem balances both survival horror and action, and it's in the earliest parts of the game that it really kind of struts its stuff in regards to this. Particularly in the first major area of the game, the hospital, or as it's known in the game, the care center. In this area, you primarily play as the latest newcomer protagonist to the series. You play as Grace Ashcroft, an FBI agent who's been pulled into the whole bioterror-based horrors thanks to a troubled and traumatic past. What makes Grace particularly unique, even among previous Resident Evil protagonists, is that she's the most underpowered everyman or every woman character that we've had in this series thus far. Grace is an FBI agent, sure, but she's an analyst and not a trained field agent. And while Resident Evil has played with this particular idea before, in both 7 and 8, where you play as Ethan Winters, that dude quickly becomes someone that's a bit far removed from normal human. Grace, on the other hand, is very much a normal person that gets thrust into the bioweapon-related horror that the remnants of Umbrella, and in particular, the Spencer Mansion experiments from the first game, bring back to the surface. And so, really, what happens in the earliest parts of the game is that you get that horror-based, underpowered survival gameplay that hardcore fans of this series love and are acutely familiar with. Grace has got a gun, sure, one that she actually gets from Leon at their first meeting, but it hardly has any bullets, and Grace is more or less left starved for resources. And what makes this particularly precarious is that there's actually a lot of zombies floating around, more than her single bullet revolver can obviously handle. And so, Grace has to rely on being stealthy, quick-witted, and on scrounging for resources and crafting makeshift weapons to survive through it all. And yeah, this is where the series' trademark survival horror gameplay comes into full focus. Requiem really does throw every trick in the Resident Evil book at you here. You get invulnerable stalker-based enemies that you have to avoid and run away from. You have zombies that are really hard to take down, unless you craft the occasional hemolytic injector that allows you to stealth kill a zombie for good. Using anything other than that injector, however, results in said zombies coming back in a more mutated, deadly form, similar to the Crimson Head zombies from the Resident Evil 1 remake. But see, Requiem does something entirely new and interesting here, in that it makes the zombies that you have to avoid and face actually smarter. It's actually such a brilliant idea, in that you have to wonder why no other horror game has ever done this before. The zombies in Requiem retain some of their personality from when they were alive, and that makes them both more deadly, but also a lot more interesting to deal with. The zombies in the care center will keep trying to do things that they would have done in their past human lives. Some will obsessively try to clean things, others will try to turn off lights, some will react to loud sounds, and others will continue to enact various routines from their lives in a sort of mime-like, creepy way. This, of course, means that these zombies have weapons and can act a hell of a lot more aggressively and kill you a lot more easily. But the brilliant thing here is that you as Grace can actually exploit and use these traits and tendencies to your advantage. This, in turn, leads to a new sort of survival stealth gameplay system, where you can use various items in the environment to lead these zombies away from certain areas, trap them, or avoid them entirely. It's a new, neat idea, and it adds some serious depth to an already pretty deep system of managing items, finding keys, solving puzzles, and slowly making your way through this complicated puzzle box of an area. And I won't mince words here. Despite how cool all of this is, the entire Grace segment of the care center is pretty darn intense. It's exhausting and it's very stressful. Between dealing with all these new types of zombies and running from the various stalker enemies, Grace is really going through one hell of a scary, horrific time. But just as it all starts to feel a bit too overwhelming, just as you're thinking that you might be kind of ready for a break, well, that's where the second half of the Resident Evil Requiem experience comes in: the Leon segments. The Leon segments in this game are really what fans of the series have come to expect after playing games like the Resident Evil 4 remake. You have tons of ammo and guns, you have these cool melee moves and attacks, not to mention a parry system with a new hatchet weapon, and a ton of awesome finishers, both environmental and with your various weapons. The experience here couldn't be more different. You trade in the survival horror for a full-fledged action third-person shooter. And the style of gameplay here is so different in that there's already a ton of funny memes online about just how different Leon and Grace are. Grace is trapped with the zombies, while the zombies are trapped with Leon. Yeah, it's a funny idea, but it's also so darn true. The Leon segments are these fun, power fantasy-like moments, where the same enemies that have been giving you so much stress and grief with grace are easily mowed down with the most satisfying and kinetic gunplay moments in the entire Resident Evil series. And it's in this way that Requiem paces its horror and tension by giving you these moments of not just reprieve, but control and power. It's the idea of the change of pace in game design, something that we've talked about before on this channel, but with the added benefit and complexity of a duo of complete tonal opposites. Opposites that work as counterbalances to each other. You struggle with Grace, you dominate with Leon, and the game constantly switches these perspectives and gameplay styles to keep you on the edge of your seat. Just as one part of the game feels like it's starting to wear you down, the game gives you the other side of the experience, and everything feels fresh and enjoyable again. And what's so impressive is that Requiem does this with two different ratios. The game mixes up the amounts in both its first and second half in terms of what it uses and how much. The first half is more Grace with a sprinkling of Leon to keep things fresh, while the second half is mostly Leon with a smidge of Grace just as the run and gun segments start to get a bit repetitive. So yeah, the mix of survival horror and action serves to both highlight and accentuate the experience of each, and it's done to various amounts and degrees by the game developers over at Capcom. And yeah, while it's all great stuff, and it largely works well, the results aren't quite at the level of perfection yet either. When looking back at the game, it's clear that the first half, the more horror with a sprinkle of action, feels like it's the better mix of the two variations. The second half could actually work equally well if some of the kinks in the combat system were ironed out a bit. Aiming is still a bit of an issue, and for some reason, Requiem, despite going for a pure fantasy action experience with its Leon segments, brings back some of the challenge and the randomization from the Resident Evil 4 remake. Enemies take a bit more ammo than they should to go down, and it's easy to miss certain shots or even misunderstand what the game is trying to have you do in some of the more action-y set-piece moments. But honestly, despite the flaws and the issues, even the Leon segments are so well done in terms of what you do, the enemies you face, and the various imaginative scenarios and problems that you're dealing with, that it all ultimately ends up working despite the flaws and the jank that can crop up here and there. Yeah, the boss battles are a bit basic and simplistic, and in general, the Leon segments feel like they could have had a bit more meat on them. But those are issues that ultimately hamper the experience by just a little bit, and are things that most people will end up ignoring for the overall fun and the really high moments, which are littered throughout this game. The formula here, even in the Leon segments, does work. It just has a bit more room to grow and be refined. Now, while this balance of horror and action is definitely the highlight of the game, there is one other balancing act that I have to mention and talk about. It's something that's definitely a bit more under the surface, but I think it's equally important, and that is in how the game handles its story and its two protagonists' character arcs. See, the other impressive thing that Requiem juggles is the way in which its story and its characters both reference the past and in how they move away from it. Here, once again, it's the dual protagonists that represent two different sides of the same idea. Grace's story and her character arc are truly new and have slight connections to the past of the Resident Evil games. Leon, on the other hand, is the grizzled veteran that's confronting a past that doesn't seem to leave him or the world at large alone. To be a bit less vague here, Grace's story is all about her living up to a legacy that she doesn't quite understand, one that comes from her mother and from the enigmatic architect of the whole Raccoon City incident in Spencer. And, spoilers ahoy now, but the way Grace's story uses Spencer and his legacy is definitely something that's very new and a huge departure for the series. Okay, here's your major spoiler warning for the last few bits of the game. So, skip ahead to the next chapter if you want to avoid stuff that spoils the ending. Going once, going twice. Okay, so, Spencer not only is the one who adopts Grace as a child and gives her a home, and then eventually connects her to her mother in Alyssa Ashcroft, who fans of the series will remember from Resident Evil Outbreak, but his big thing in this game, the MacGuffin that everybody is fighting for, is this bioweapon called Elpis. Except, it turns out that Elpis isn't a bioweapon at all. It's not even a new virus or even a parasite, but it's actually an antiviral cure for some of Spencer's previous work. So, Grace ends up being the character that not only deals with this bioterror thing that the Resident Evil franchise has always had, but then she also charts her own course and is very much someone who grows through her fear and pain towards a hopeful and ultimately satisfying future, one where a cure for all the horrors she's faced actually exists. Leon, on the other hand, is someone who relives a lot of the horror that has defined him and the series up till this point. There's a pretty interesting little narrative device in that Leon is infected with a sort of black infection that both he and the other remaining survivors of Raccoon City seem to have. A latent, secondhand infection from the T-virus that they were all exposed to. In any case, it's through him that Requiem looks back at and provides some of the most fan-servicey moments in this series. It's just something else to see a more powerful, fully trained killing machine of a Leon come back to the ruins of Raccoon City and make his way through it and some notable places like the RPD, the orphanage, and a new but similar underground lab. For Leon, the story is about understanding and accepting the past, but also it's about how to prevent another tragedy like Raccoon City, and ultimately, it's about him actually making a difference this time instead of just surviving. Leon confronts the demons of the past and tries to save Grace, while Grace does her best to survive and keep her humanity, and ultimately ends up saving the heroic legend himself in the end. And it's this mix of the old stuff from the series, the callbacks to Umbrella, to Raccoon City, and everything that happened there, and the new stuff regarding Elpis, Grace, and the experiments that the game's antagonist in Victor Gideon has been running since the incident of Raccoon City that are both refreshing and intriguing. There's even a connection to Chris Redfield, the BSAA, and the Connection's terrorist organization that all link back to the more recent Resident Evils 7 and 8. Ultimately, whether it's the narrative or the interactive gameplay, each is expertly balancing two very disparate elements of the series, and ultimately, they create a cocktail that's got a unique and refreshing taste of its own. And it's in this balance of old and new, of horror and action, and the myriads of ways in which the game caters to different types of people that the game is able to reach perhaps the widest audience that the series has ever been able to. To that end, there's a lot of options for players to get their best experience here. There's the choice, for instance, of playing the game in either first or third person, or in using a mix of the two. These aren't shoehorned in options either, as third person has its own unique set of animations, while first person is definitely more immersive. Then there's the two gameplay modes at the start, with a classic and a modern option that gives you the choice between unlimited saves or the classic ink ribbon style resource management as well. Requiem and its development team don't judge any particular part of its diverse audience. They give everyone the options, they highlight aspects of each of the franchise's different appealing aspects, and ultimately craft a video game that's really made for every sort of Resident Evil fan. And it's this sort of game design, this sort of narrative design, of appealing to such a wide swath of different players and fans that each value different things, that really is the crowning achievement of this game. It's something that has not only succeeded, but charted a new course for the entire series. Much like how I called the Resident Evil 4 remake a second turning point for the Resident Evil series in my video on that game, a game that brought back the horror into an action-focused experience, Resident Evil Requiem is the crystallization of a new winning formula that this series can now use for a ton of its future entries. After so many slow, careful, methodical steps with the remakes and the newer first-person survival horror entries, it finally feels like Resident Evil has not only gone back to being really good, but is now the leader of the pack in terms of horror games. With both the critical and commercial success of this game, the future is not only super bright for Resident Evil and Capcom, but it's also really exciting. There are story tidbits that can be expanded upon in either a DLC or in a future game. And this same formula of dual protagonists and gameplay styles can be used again in future entries. Claire Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Carlos, Chris Redfield, any of these characters can adopt the role that Leon played in this game, alongside the next generation of protagonists like Grace and Ethan. The possibilities for both story and gameplay are now almost endless and are ripe for further exploration. Count me among those eagerly anticipating the next Resident Evil game, whether it's another remake or an entirely new entry that continues this formula. With all that said, as always, in the end, I'm curious about what you, the fan of Resident Evil that made it to the end of this video, think of all this. Did Requiem nail this balance for you? What were your favorite parts of the game? What were your least favorite parts of the game? Do you like Grace as a new protagonist? Or do you want the older characters like Leon to kind of dominate the scene? Feel free to leave a comment down below and sound off with your thoughts on this latest entry. And also, please leave a like and subscribe if you found my little analysis of Resident Evil Requiem to be useful or at the very least amusing. Thank you for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the comment section down below, or at the very least in the next video.